a priori, what has to be there prior to us having an experience. So if we think that there is such a thing as an a priori, a basis, and what we're trying to do with philosophy is figure out what that a priori is. What's the basis or the ground for experience? What's there before we have an experience? And once we have an experience, then we have the posteriori. So I've had this experience. Now, as the British empiricists say, I've had this experience written on my previously tabula rasa. Right now it's got something written on it. So I've had an experience. But unless there's some a priori there, says Kant, and really David Hume, I can't do philosophy, not in the historical sense. And we have synthetic and analytic. Information. Well, the analytic information is based on what we know to be the case, and we analyze it. So, for example, all horses are animals. This is essentially the all SRP and the no SRP, the universal statements that Aristotle gives us. That's where we get our analytic information. Well, synthetic information is some S is P, some S is not P. Well, if we look at the kinds of experiences we have, once I have an experience, thank you, David Hume, I now have had a synthetic knowledge. I've gained a specific knowledge. I've seen a specific horse, and that horse has a particular characteristic. It's a pinto, whatever, right? So I know that about that particular horse. And if I've seen enough of those, what I normally would think is that then I can have a definition of pinto horses. I've seen enough of them that as a result of this experience, I now have all pinto horses look like this. Would Hume have accepted that? I'm not sure, because he would have argued, of course, that what grounds do you have for the resemblance statements that you're saying there, right? But for Kant, we do have this, once we've had enough experiences. And as a result of that, I end up then with analytic a priori information, so that when I go back out to visit Palmer and I drive by the same farm and I see the same horse, I already have expected it. It might have been inside the barn if it's snowing out or whatever, but at the same time, I recognize that. So this information leads to this kind of information, which leads to this kind of information. But now here's the problem. Synthetic a priori would mean I have to have a brand new experience for the first time, right? Brand new. And yet I have to already know something about what that experience is going to be. And thanks to David Hume, we realize we cannot have what Kant refers to as a synthetic a priori. There is no such thing, according to David Hume. So Kant is then going to try to figure out how to answer David Hume, because unless there's some sort of a synthetic a priori, you can't actually do philosophy, because that's what we're actually looking for. Plato thought that the synthetic a priori were the world of ideas. There's all these ideas, and as we have experience, we're experiencing those ideas because our souls are connected to these ideas. Can you test that in the laboratory? No. There's no way to test that in the laboratory. Well, Aristotle comes along and says, aha, well, what we're seeing, of course, are these individual objects, and nature has created these objects. He doesn't say they are evolved, right? Because for Aristotle, it's kind of a persistent world, right? And so everything has its own telos, everything has its own matter, everything has its own shape, and everything has been formed by some force in order to be what it is. But we can know that in some sort of direct way by observing the objects and so on. And so there is a synthetic a priori for Aristotle, but can you prove it? Well, of course, thanks to people like John Locke, who first separated us from the idea that we could see the objects directly. Berkeley that argued, well, but it's all in the mind of God, and Hume that says, what God? What experience are you sharing? What proof do you have for that? We no longer have an argument that basically supplies the kind of a priori that Aristotle gives us. So we're basically lost as far as philosophy is concerned. So how does Kant answer David Hume? It's kind of revolutionary. In fact, Kant referred to it as his own Copernican revolution in thought, which actually seems just the opposite, because remember, Copernicus's revolution was the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system and the Earth goes around it, instead of the opposite, right? So if you think, well, wait a minute, Kant is now going to give us such a Copernican revolution where instead of the sun going around the Earth goes around the sun. He's actually going to give us just the opposite, because he's going to point out that I am the center of my own universe. I'm the one that frames my experiences. So what does Kant do? He says that we actually have the experience of phenomena. All phenomena as we experience it. This is what David Hume is talking about. All the impressions that I'm getting are phenomena. And as I'm receiving this phenomena, there has to be a self, an ego, that's receiving that information. Of course, that's Descartes. And Hume accepts that, except that Hume, of course, argues that there's no persistent self over here, whereas Kant isn't going to argue whether it's persistent or not. It's just that in order for you to receive a phenomena, there has to be a self that's receiving it, and there also has to be the thing in itself. This is essentially John Locke's point of view, that you actually have to have objects that are interacting with our senses in order for us to have the experience in the first place. So that all has to be there, even though you can't see the thing in itself. So he agrees with Hume. Can't see that. I can't actually see my ego. But in order for me to have any experience at all, there first has to be the experience of time. This goes back, of course, to Aristotle, but now the experience of time is not something that Kant is hypothesizing as existing in time and space. It's instead, you yourself are framing all of your experiences in time. And in fact, we might not all agree on how fast time is going. In fact, you might not feel like time proceeds at the same speed from one moment to the next, depending on your mood or your enthusiasm. You know, if you're at a game or something where you're excited and things happen quickly, you might feel like, oh my goodness, time just went so fast, didn't it? And then other times where you're sitting in, say, a philosophy class, listening to a lecture about stuff at 12:30 in the afternoon. You could be, when is this going to be over? Time could be going really slowly. And if it feels like it's going slowly, it certainly is going slowly, isn't it? How would you compare it to anything else, right? But everything has to take time. You can't imagine anything not happening with time elapsing. Even just sitting in a chair thinking, or even falling asleep, all of that takes time. We frame everything in time. And if it has dimensions, it also has to take up space. But it doesn't take up space in the world. It takes up space in our own experience from my own perspective. So for example, if I'm holding up this magic marker, and notice it takes up exactly this much space. Keep your focus on that space for a minute and watch what happens. Notice that space is still there. Can I do that again? Notice? It looks like the magic marker is taking up space, but notice the reason the space is there is because you're projecting that space there, not because the magic marker took up space. This is Kant, right? So in other words, all of the experience you're having is coming from your human psychology, the way you perceive time and space. So for example, you then add to this, and this becomes, as you can imagine, the a priori that's missing for David Hume. It's now being added back again, and it's of course remarkably similar to the kinds of quantity and quality and relationships that Aristotle gives us, although Kant gives us 12 of them. End up with 12 instead of 10. But as a result of this, we end up with so he's got 4 groups of 3, as you can see. Quantity, which includes unity, plurality, and totality. Reality, negation, and limitation is part of quality. Relations give us inherence and subsistence, causality and dependence, and community. All those things you could see they come from Hume, but they're actually Aristotle as well. Modality, possibility, existence, necessity. Those are Aristotelian. So he's basically taking all of Aristotle's categories and applying them now, but not to the world as it is. So he's not describing the characteristics of things in space. He's instead talking about the way the human mind views things this way. So these characteristics are not something that's out there in the world. They might be, but notice our limitation, thanks to these British empiricists, is we can't actually see those things, but we can at least recognize that all human beings experience things in these relationships, and so it must instead be the categories of the mind that arrange our phenomenal experiences this way. So that's where the a priori is here. Now, of course, Kant doesn't actually explain psychologically where this comes from. And so we're going to end up with a whole bunch of new psychology trying to figure that out in response to Kant. That's why if you look at my test question, we're already looking at test 3 now. So notice these are the test 3 questions.